Latrun is unique. I don't know if there are many other places which left wounds as Latrun. It's a wound up to now.
I felt that I was given people to fight a war, and here they are killed, and I am responsible.
Latrun is a stain in the collective Israeli memory. This is probably the worst battle of all. This is the battle where repeatedly the Jewish forces failed to achieve their goal, their objective.
We didn't lose, we won. The battle Latrun as itself failed. But if you take it as part of a big picture, I'm not sure it failed. We established communication with Jerusalem. Wasn't that the purpose?
From the vantage point of today, Latrun seems a very straightforward battle. But from the point of view of the War of Independence, the 48 War, it was one of the more complex and more mysterious battles.
Latrun. It was here on the historic plains of Ayalon during Israel's 1948 War of Independence that a series of bitter and fateful battles was fought to open the road to Jerusalem. Out of those battles was born one of the darkest and most divisive myths of the war, that hundreds, if not thousands, of Jewish soldiers had been killed in the fighting, that many among them were Holocaust survivors newly arrived in Israel. And underlying the controversy, the troubling question of whether the battle should have been fought at all. Over the years, subject to endless interpretation, the myth of Latrun has become a lens through which to view much of Israel, bringing into sharp focus the turbulence that has so defined this nation. A nation still today struggling with its memory, its history, and its identity.
Israel is a very ideological society, a very nationalist society. And a nationalist society cannot survive as such if it is not fed by myth, especially foundational myth. Myth and reality get mixed in Israel. It's much more a country of mythology than of history.
For the Battle of Latrun, that history began in the weeks and months before Israel's War of Independence, in what was then known as Palestine. Years of ineffectual British rule had left the region in turmoil. Conflicting promises of statehood made to both the Arab and Jewish inhabitants only made matters worse. Finally, in November 1947, the United Nations voted to divide the land between the two peoples.
The resolution was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against.
Jerusalem would remain an international city. The British would withdraw in 6 months. Immediately, fighting erupted throughout Palestine as the Arab and Jewish populations clashed over future rights to the land. For both sides, it was a war of survival.
There were two peoples living in the country, each one convinced that the whole country belongs to it alone, that the other side doesn't really exist. And the overriding principle of both sides was to grab as much territory as possible, knowing, of course, that any side which loses the war does not only lose the war, but loses its country and its very existence.
By the spring of 1948, the conflict had intensified as local Palestinian Arabs fought with members of the Jewish underground militia known as the Haganah, spearheaded by the Palmach, its elite, fiercely proud strike force. In Jerusalem, where some of the most bitter fighting took place, the city was effectively divided into Jewish and Arab sections. Maintaining access to the city from Tel Aviv became crucial for the Jews and increasingly difficult. The main road to Jerusalem was a narrow passage snaking its way up into the Judean hills, passing through Latrun. From April 1948, any Jewish traffic on it was subject to attack from Arab villagers in the hills above. Only a few Jewish supply convoys from outside managed to break through to their areas of the city.
And Jerusalem was starting to starve. There was not enough food, not enough gasoline, not enough water, and of course not enough ammunition and so forth. The problem was how to keep Jerusalem alive and open the road to Jerusalem.
On May 14, 1948, Britain's rule in Palestine ended and the last of its troops withdrew. That same day, with David Ben-Gurion the new Prime Minister and Minister of Defense, the State of Israel was declared. Opposed to this unilateral declaration of independence, on the following morning the armies of the 5 surrounding Arab countries invaded, marking the start of all-out war. The Syrians and Lebanese advanced from the north, the Egyptians from the south, and the Jordanians, aided by the Iraqis, from the east.
Let's sit in Ben-Gurion's chair for a moment, right? And he looks at the whole situation. And everywhere in the country, there's disaster. There's disaster. I mean, on all fronts, it's horrible. Like you're sitting in your house and your house is burning. And you have to ask yourself the question, what do I do, right? I have 3 minutes, right? What do I do? Do I save the children? Do I save this? Do I save that? How do I save? What do I do? Every step you take is maybe right or wrong.
On May 16th, Jordan's Arab Legion, trained by the British and considered the best army of the Arab world, began shelling Jewish West Jerusalem. Two days later, Jordan's King Abdullah, in what he viewed as defense of the Islamic holy sites, ordered the legion to advance on the city.
He felt he had to take Jerusalem. He also was afraid that if he didn't take Jerusalem, the Jews would take East Jerusalem. They would end up occupying the old city and Arab East Jerusalem if he didn't defend it. But in going into East Jerusalem, he then understood, Abdullah and his general, General Blub, understood that they must weaken the Israelis so that the Israelis don't have a chance to take East Jerusalem. And you do that by blocking the road to Jerusalem, by blocking the road for reinforcements from the Jewish coastal plain reaching Jerusalem. You can block it at Latrun.
With the siege on Jerusalem now growing worse, Ben-Gurion began receiving daily telegrams pleading for help.
There was no way to Jerusalem, and the situation was really bad. And if it would go on like this, maybe Jerusalem would fall. It wasn't only the problem of the Jews of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a symbol. All the dreams, all the hopes, all the thoughts of Jews for 2,000 years was not Israel, but Jerusalem.
Ben-Gurion thought at the time that if Jerusalem will fall, the whole thing will collapse. And I think this was all the time behind his thinking. Now, everybody agreed with him on the fact that if Jerusalem will fall, it will be the end maybe of the whole establishment of the State of Israel. But there were differences of opinion how bad the situation was.
The dispute over conditions in Jerusalem led to heated debates between Ben-Gurion and his senior military staff.
Yigael Yadin, who was the operation officer of the IDF Haganah Jewish General Staff, he told Ben-Gurion, don't be that nervous about Jerusalem. But Ben-Gurion was really afraid that there is a danger that Jerusalem would be conquered by the Jordanians against the direction or the decisions of the United Nations General Assembly.
To relieve Jerusalem, you had to get equipment and supplies and food and water and so forth to Jerusalem. To do that, you had to open the road to Jerusalem. To open the road to Jerusalem meant to capture Latrun.
Straddling the main road to Jerusalem, Latrun is a high and imposing shoulder of land dominating the valley below. The Arab-held enclave consisted of an ancient Crusader fort long in ruins, a hilltop Arab village, a monastery of Trappist monks, and a heavily fortified police station built by the British during World War II.
The General Staff objected to the Battle of Latrun from the beginning. They were against attacking. And the General Staff believed that the Egyptian invasion is by far the most dangerous because it endangered Tel Aviv, which was the real heart of the Jewish state, not Jerusalem.
Ben-Gurion, though, refused to bow to the pressure of his staff. With his fateful command, at all costs Jerusalem, he gave the order to take Latrun. For the operation, Ben-Gurion turned to the 7th Brigade, a newly established fighting unit based on the British model of a regular army. For the Palmach underground militia, this move was viewed as a direct threat to its status and authority within the new army. Further opposition arose within the Palmach when British Army veteran Shlomo Shamir was given command of the 7th Brigade. Eager to carry out Ben-Gurion's orders, and knowing time was not on his side, Shamir began the daunting task of organizing his new unit.
The problem that we are facing, you had about 3 days to get 2,000 people together, clothe them, equip them, organize them into military groups, appoint their commanders, check what they know, get them to arrange to fire, check out exactly their abilities, put the whole thing into a system whereby you can go into a battle.
With the clock ticking on Jewish Jerusalem, Shamir also faced the obstacle of scarce manpower. To help fill the ranks of the 7th, Brigade Command turned to the only sure source available, the newly arrived immigrants from Europe, the Olim Hadashim, survivors of the Holocaust.
We didn't have enough people, so here come the immigration. A big discussion, should the new immigrants take part in the battles or not? God forbid if we didn't take them in to take part of it. There would have never been a recreation of the unity of the Jewish people.
They came here to be retrieved, to start new living, to leave the Holocaust arena, to start working, building families here in the land of Israel, to make a better future. For us, they were some kind of a reinforcement. We saw them, oh, it's very good that you came. Help us to continue the war.
The leadership felt that indeed immigrants, in order to become part of the community, have to take part in the military effort. Whether they were able to do so or not didn't interest anyone. What was important for them is to show that this is the highest level of commitment. I remember one sentence of David Ben-Gurion who said, there is a problem with the Holocaust survivor. They haven't yet sacrificed anyone in the defense of the homeland. He wanted them to have martyrs, people who died in defending the homeland. He thought this would put them on par, on an equal level with the veteran Sabras, the heroic soldiers of the Haganah.
I knew that I'm coming to fight, and I wanted to come and fight here for my country. Nobody said that I'll stay, I'll be alive after the war. I came and I knew maybe I'll die during the war, but I wanted to do this.
145 new immigrants were recruited into the 7th Brigade. While they comprised less than 10% of the total manpower, the new immigrants' presence at the battles would become one of the most controversial elements of the story of Latrun, and be forever linked to the myth that developed out of it. By May 22nd, the 7th Brigade was assembled at Kibbutz Nan, where it stepped up preparations for battle. In Jerusalem, the situation for the Jews was rapidly deteriorating. What's more, there was increasing talk of a United Nations ceasefire that, once in effect, would give de facto control of the city to the Arabs. For the 7th Brigade, pressure was mounting to attack Latrun as soon as possible.
Ben-Gurion was the one who pushed us like crazy. You've got 2 more days to open the road or we lost Jerusalem. You've got 1 more day or we lost Jerusalem.
The troops moved on to the final staging area for the operation at Kibbutz Hulda. As the night of the attack approached, both Yigal Yadin and Shlomo Shamir knew the 7th Brigade was still not prepared. They pressed Ben-Gurion to postpone the battle 24 hours. Reluctantly, he agreed. Hurried, last-minute intelligence briefings prior to the operation included an assessment of the enemy forces in the hills.
I asked the brigade commander, what are the Arab forces in Latrun? How many? And he said, only few irregulars, and we'll take it like that.
Operation Ben Nun, the first attempt to take Latrun, was ordered to commence on May 24th, 10 p.m. Various delays pushed the departure time from Hulda well past midnight, a factor that would prove costly for an operation dependent on night cover. At last underway, buses carrying the men arrived at the drop point some 5 kilometers from Latrun itself. The time was now 4 a.m.
Our battalion, being the most experienced one, we had the central task of the operation. We were supposed to capture the village Latrun and the hill near it, and then go to the police station, capture the police station, open the road to Jerusalem, and then the convoy was supposed to go through. A 2nd battalion from the 7th Brigade were supposed to go towards the hills that are closer to Bab el-Wad on our right flank.
This part of the operation was led by 2 companies of the 72nd Battalion, one of which held nearly all of the new immigrant soldiers. At approximately 5:15 a.m., infantry units of the 32nd Battalion began their advance through the valley directly below Latrun.
We might have been a few hundred meters from the monastery wall. Fire opened from all directions.
Suddenly, we were caught by very heavy machine gun fire. I had immediately several casualties.
Asher Levy was in front and I was just after him. They opened fire with, I don't know, hundreds of rifles and machine guns and began shelling. It was like facing a wall of fire.
As the sky began to lighten over the hills, the men under fire faced another enemy, daylight. The Arab attack on the soldiers in the valley intensified, using British 25-pound cannons, long-range mortars, and heavy machine gun fire. Intelligence, it turned out, had been woefully inadequate. The 7th Brigade now found itself under full attack, not by Arab irregulars, but by the vaunted Arab Legion that had only days earlier occupied the Latrun enclave. This would prove to be one of the gravest miscalculations of the Battle of Latrun.
Our situation was very difficult. We had with us light weapons, rifles and machine guns. They had artillery and shells with shrapnel that spread and came down on us like rain. And this caused us many casualties.
When the shells started falling there, it started burning. It looked like hell. Everything was burning. From Latrun till Hulda, everything was afire.
On the far side of the hill opposite Latrun, known as Hill 314, the 72nd Battalion was advancing towards the village of Dir Ayoub. These units, whose ranks were filled with the new immigrants, also began to come under heavy fire.
The artillery started, he couldn't move. Duvdevani, the boss, was killed. Many of the people around him. I had to put everybody down, lie down, lie down, lie down.
The whole company was trapped, but I decided that on the hill it should be better. So I went up and told them, let's go. If you stay here, you'll all be killed. And they rose, and the newcomers, you know, the New Olim, listened to me and rose and ran after me.
Now, roughly 8 o'clock in the morning, the sun was fully up, exposing all brigade positions to Arab firepower. Making matters worse, the sun brought with it a host of new problems.
Now, it was May. It was terribly hot. It was Khamsin.
Khamsin is a very hot eastern wind with a lot of little flies, which are called barkhaj. Barkhaj is a very tiny fly which goes into every opening in your body.
They get into your ears and into your nose, your mouth and eyes. The amount of these tiny, tiny flies are in the millions. They made it very, very difficult for our fighters.
Compounding the difficulties of the heat and flies was the lack of enough water canteens to supply the parched men.
No shade at all, hardly any water. Those who came from abroad, men that came right from Europe, it was shocking, just shocking. Even the Israeli-born men could hardly really take it.
I was very thirsty. I would say dead thirsty. We didn't have water with us. There was a mud there, some dirty water with some blood of the wounded. And, you know, I hesitated. I knew that I'll not make it if I'll not drink. So at the end, I just put my head down and I drank from this water.
All the while, Arab firepower continued to take its toll. And it was Asher Levy's company, trapped in the valley below Latrun, that suffered the worst of it.
They were firing at us from any direction. Anyone who just took his head over the rock got hit. You can see your people being hit, and they look at you, and you don't know what to do.
Back at headquarters in Hulda, Shlomo Shamir knew everything was collapsing around him.
You don't have force. You don't have force, that's all. They shoot at you, you have nothing to answer. People have to be moved, you don't have the transport to move them. People have to be saved and helped, you don't have any, you don't have. So you ask yourself, now, come on, if you're a commander and you don't have, so what sort of a commander it is? Well, this is what it was.
For the soldiers in the field, retreat was now the only option. The order was given to withdraw to higher, more protected ground atop Hill 314. While shell shock and exhaustion plagued many of the retreating soldiers, what's most remembered was the reaction of the new immigrants.
We hollered at them. There was a soldier lying on the ground who belonged to the 7th Brigade. I picked him up, slapped his face, and told him, "Go back." That's the way these soldiers wander about. It looked like they lost their will and didn't realize that by moving back they could save themselves. We kept hollering, "Move back, move back."
Once on Hill 314, the retreating soldiers began to make their way toward Beit Jiz, a deserted Arab village 2 kilometers away, where Brigade Command had assured them help would be waiting. But there was no help. The wounded who stayed behind would later die at the hands of the pursuing Arabs, while those who could began making their way back to Hulda.
I cannot
describe, I mean, the horrified things that we have seen there. I mean, the people that were injured and shock. And there was a lot of, I mean, we all have cried. Very terrible day.
The loss at Latrun was a bitter defeat for the Jews, quickly spawning rumors that spread across the country. Chief among them was the story that hundreds, perhaps even more, had been killed on the battlefield.
People could not decide who were alive and who was dead. And until they started counting, the rumors started circulating. And as a result, the numbers grew in the imagination of people who heard about it.
Israeli military censorship prevented accurate press reporting of what happened on the battlefield, while overseas newspapers cited Arab Legion communiques that greatly inflated Israeli casualty figures. For years, these figures were the only ones available. Adding to the horror of the events at Latrun, an even more disturbing story was beginning to come out, that many of those who died were new immigrants, young men who had survived the Holocaust only to be sent to their deaths at Latrun.
This was the first battle that the newcomers were an integral part in. A whole unit was based on them. And even though they were not the major players in this battle, nevertheless, those newcomers were very prominent because they did not speak the language, they could not communicate with the others, and the fact that they were inexperienced in this country played upon the imagination and the guilt feelings of all the others.
There was some, though, who actually used the presence of the new immigrants as an explanation for the loss on the battlefield.
Immediately after the first Battle of Latrun, the rumor surfaced saying that a large number of the participants, why had the battle failed? Because a large number of participants had been non-veterans, Holocaust survivors who hadn't fired a gun before, and so on. And therefore, they threw in raw troops against hardened Arab Legion troops, and therefore they lost.
While this first battle marked the birth of what would later develop into the myth of Latrun, a second battle, only days away, would sear that myth into the collective memory of the country.
All of us, we knew about Latrun, and we knew about the others who fought there before. And Latrun was like a nightmare for everyone, because it was, Jerusalem will be ours or not. And it depends very much on opening the way. And Latrun was the place which closed the way.
In Jerusalem, the siege tightened. On May 28th, the Jewish quarter of the Old City, no longer able to hold out, surrendered to the Arab Legion. Opening the road to Jerusalem was now more urgent than ever. David Ben-Gurion pressed Shlomo Shamir to ready his brigade for the second attempt to take Latrun. Arab Legion forces, now estimated to be one full battalion, but actually two, were firmly entrenched in the hills. This time, 7th Brigade Command thought they knew what to expect.
There was a lot of optimistic feeling that this time we can do it. We had the infantry, we had those half trucks, we had armored cars. There was big hope, that we're going to do it.
The battle plan called for a two-pronged attack on the entire Latrun Ridge, with the main thrust to be directed at the police station compound. It was here that the heaviest fighting would take place, and where the final outcome of the battle would be determined. At 3:40 a.m. on May 31st, the 73rd Battalion set out towards its objective.
The whole battalion split into three heads. One was going to the monastery of Latrun, another to the village of Latrun, and our platoon was going to the police station of Latrun.
The half-tracks proceeded smoothly toward the yard and entered inside without any interference.
As they faced the police station, suddenly the Jordanians opened up with a very heavy barrage of fire and grenades from the station. From our half tracks, we opened up with flamethrowers, spreading fire on the wooden barracks that were around the station and also on the police station itself.
The moment in which the explosion people were able to, with their flamethrowers, put in fire the whole wall of the police station was the most exciting moment, because we thought that you won this battle.
The whole police station was lit up with flamethrowers. It's like the whole police station was burning. It looked to me like nobody in the police could survive that, but I was wrong.
Due to this big flame on the police station, the Arab Legion knew immediately where we were and what is going on. They saw everything. So the fire on the 4 half tracks started to go heavier and heavier and more precise. You heard the bullets on the walls of the half tracks.
The Jordanians took advantage of the fact that the half track was open on the top and very vulnerable. So in addition to shooting, they also threw grenades into the half tracks. The half tracks started burning, and that's how most of the men who were in or around them got killed.
In what would become one of the most remembered stories of Bin Noon II, a radio operator was trapped in an armored car inside the police station yard, unable to retreat, desperately pleading for help. Her name was Hadassah Lempel.
The Hadassah is shouting that we need help, we need help, we need help. And nobody can help. And then she stopped crying.
With the attack on the police station clearly failing, all units on the Latrun Ridge were finally ordered to retreat.
That was the end of the second day, which was a lot of hope and big misery. And the road was closed.
This second bitter loss further fed the rumors growing out of Bin Noon I and provided more ammunition for those who would later criticize the entire Latrun operation. Meanwhile, Jewish Jerusalem was still under siege. The United Nations' latest ceasefire date was now set for June 11th, little more than a week away. If the Jews were to lay claim to any portion of Jerusalem, it was imperative they establish a connection to the city. But with Latrun still in the hands of the Arab Legion, another way would have to be found. Earlier, before Bin Noon II, 7th Brigade forces had opened a rough supply road south of the Latrun enclave, leading up into the rugged Judean hills. On the night of May 29th, a Palmach jeep set out from that road, trying to find a way through to Jerusalem. A chance meeting with a second jeep coming down from the city proved the existence of an alternate route, though impassable for the large truck convoys needed to relieve Jewish West Jerusalem.
Jerusalem was a city of 90 or 200,000 people. You can understand the amount of supplies that were required in order to support that kind of a city. You had to build a road, and this was done by the 7th Brigade.
So in the first few days we were doing handwork. We went out with shovels and with picks, and we started to clear a roadway, make a sort of a roadway so that vehicles can come up. What happened is we were working around the clock. The boys used to sleep mostly out in the field. We didn't even have time to take a break.
Shlomo Shamir's 7th Brigade worked feverishly digging this initial stretch of road.
10 o'clock in the morning on the 11th of June, this will be the ceasefire. And that set a timetable towards which you had to work, whether you like it or not, whether it's possible or impossible.
Beyond the first few kilometers, the land rose sharply into the hills, then suddenly dropped off into a steep valley. Progress slowed to a crawl. But the movement of supplies continued by any and every means.
There was a period where you could move trucks up to the edge and trucks from Jerusalem down in the valley. And people carried the load from the trucks up on their back to the trucks down.
All kind. Sometimes fruits, sometimes bread, sometimes flour, sometimes medicine, sometimes ammunition.
On June 9th, 2 days before the ceasefire, in another attempt to open the main road, a third attack on Latrun was launched, this by an experienced Palmach unit. It too failed. The pressure on those building the road was now greater than ever, and engineering the critical section known as the Serpentine, with its steep grade and boulder-strewn face, threatened the entire operation.
I was sent a group of demolition workers from Jerusalem because they were experts in drilling and demolition work. So we started blowing up the rocks. At this stage, I believe that the Arabs took notice that something is happening. And they started shelling the area.
The shelling and sniper fire from the hillsides caused increasing casualties. Work on the Serpentine, though, continued around the clock. The morning of June 11th arrived. The ceasefire was now only hours away, and the convoy could wait no longer. With United Nations observers on hand to witness the attempted breakthrough, the order was given to move out. As the trucks slowly made their way up into the hills, foreign correspondents, recalling the British supply line built between Burma and China during World War II, dubbed this new route the Burma Road.
I was standing up on the summit of the castle, which is a high mountain, and suddenly the road to Jerusalem, which was empty all those weeks, I saw slowly cars coming one by one, jeeps, trucks. A friend of mine had a trumpet, and he blew the trumpet. It was like in a, like a scene in the film.
People were standing and crying, simply standing along the road, clapping hands and crying.
We saw soldiers, the first soldiers that came from the area of Tel Aviv, and they hugged us, and we cried. And then they said, "What do we want?" And we said two things. You have fresh tomatoes and cigarettes. And that was the first convoy that came to Jerusalem through the road of Burma.
In establishing the connection between Jerusalem and the rest of Israel, the Burma Road helped define the terms of the ceasefire and opened the way to the relief of Jerusalem's Jewish population. For Commander Shlomo Shamir, the triumph of building the Burma Road removed some of the bitterness of the defeat suffered at Latrun and stood as ultimate proof of the victory Ben-Gurion had demanded.
Was it a failure or a success? And I can only say the only real witness, the road to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem surviving as it is, in reality, is the witness to the great success it was in the conditions of survival that led the state to go on.
Others didn't see it that way. During the ceasefire of June and July 1948, several high-ranking army officers, among them members of the Palmach, accused Ben-Gurion of serious tactical mismanagement in the first phase of the war. Held up as evidence of Ben-Gurion's failed leadership were inflated accounts of the losses suffered at Latrun. Yigal Yadin.
This action should never have been taken. A battalion went into battle with 3 days of training. Soldiers came directly from the immigration ships and went directly to the recruitment center. That day men fell in battle as never before, and in my opinion, needlessly, without any chance of capturing Latrun.
David Ben-Gurion.
My opinion is that it was a great victory, but it was not cheap. In the overall assessment of the battle for Jerusalem, this was vital and indirectly saved the entire campaign.
And those who wished to attack Ben-Gurion and to attack Shlomo Shamir and the like, they found in Latrun a case study to show how those people did not know how to lead the army in a decisive battle that decided the future of the road to Jerusalem and in which so many people died. This was how they wanted to blame Ben-Gurion for the defeat. Not only for the defeat, for causing the death of survivors of the Holocaust in a battle that was in vain. What can be worse than that?
There was a poem about Piotr the Great paving the road to St. Petersburg with the bodies of Russian peasants, and Ben-Gurion paving the road to Jerusalem with the bodies of young Holocaust survivors. It's absolutely unbased on facts. But this is the feeling and the image which certain people try to encourage.
The cumulative effect of these accusations was powerful. Whether motivated by horrific accounts from the battlefield, inaccurate press coverage, or Palmach attacks on Ben-Gurion, the rumors, especially about the number of casualties, eventually took on a life of their own.
It started with a few hundreds, and with time, people talked about thousands of casualties, escalating from one decade to the other, and even before that. Even in the 80s, members of the Knesset talked about 2,000 dead from the Battle of Latrun. It's unbelievable that people could have considered Latrun to have such a number of casualties. This is only to show you the influence of the myth in creating the image of Latrun as a monstrous battle, as a monstrous defeat.
In the late 1980s, Shlomo Shamir, in hopes of at last setting the record straight on Latrun, researched and wrote a highly detailed book on the battles. In it, he provided an exact accounting of all casualties suffered at Latrun, a figure far less than the myth suggested. 71 dead in Ben Nun 1, 49 dead in Ben Nun 2, and 19 dead between the battles and during the construction of the Burma Road. Out of the total of 139 casualties, only 15 were actually new immigrants. Though Shamir's book did correct some of the gross misperceptions regarding casualties, the issue of the new immigrants was another matter.
The myth of Latrun in the case of the number of immigrants who died is not really related to numbers. Very pedantic and empiricist historians like to argue and waste a lot of ink, so to speak, on figures, on numbers, as if the numbers are really important for the construction of myth, or if you have the accurate number, you can destroy a myth or debunk it. And I don't think it's very true. I think what is important is that there were enough immigrants who died over Latrun.
There is no other battle in which the role of the survivors is so crucial to the story as the Battle of Latrun. The more the impact of the Holocaust on Israeli imagination, the stronger the story of Latrun became. And in a way, Latrun became the central battle of the survivors in the War of Independence.
My feeling is that little by little the story of the, quote, new immigrants penetrated into some people's minds, possibly because of the explanations of the squad leaders or participants in the battle, in which they try to explain to themselves their own failures. From that time on, people slowly adopted the line, so what do you expect to do with new immigrants?
For them, Latrun is one of the proofs, maybe the ultimate proof, for the way they were treated by the veteran Jewish establishment.
Haganah army was composed of people who grew up in this country. We all had a superiority complex. We all considered ourselves as a kind of Superman. We were conscious of creating a new nation. We thought that we are the new nation, and everybody else who's coming should adapt to us and become like us as quickly as possible.
It's not that they didn't want to hear about us being in the concentration camps or in the Yiddish shtetl somewhere in Poland, but we wanted to forget it more than they didn't want to speak about it. I wanted to forget it. I want to have it behind me and be a new person, just a new person, to start a new life.
The Latrun space, if you want, is where the Holocaust survivors learned how they could prevent another Holocaust from forever taking place. And it's very clear how they can do it. They have a Jewish gun, a Jewish fighting force, a Jewish army.
Eventually, the survivors claimed for themselves the story of Latrun. We, the survivors, also want our place in the annals of the War of Independence. And we want to be part of the collective bravery story of the War of Independence.
I think every community of people, state or group, whether it's rational or not, build its legacy, its inheritance. So now when you go back to the War of Independence, I think our aim is to try and get it into a legacy which is a source of power, that you can be proud of even if you had losses. It is in that texture that I put it to you, the Latrun battle, the battle for Jerusalem.
Overlooking the highway connecting Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, Latrun today is a familiar landmark in Israel. A war memorial that celebrates the country's military might and stands as a testament to the power and influence of Israel's early myths, those of the warrior hero and of a nation endlessly fighting for survival. It is these myths, among others, that are now being challenged as a new generation confronts its nation's past, questions the conventional beliefs of its history, and in that context, further reinterprets the story of Latrun.
The great sacrifice in Latrun can be turned on its head and used as a myth to propagate being a nation willing to sacrifice and an image of a nation which is unwilling to make concessions because of the sacrifices it has made and so on. Because we paid such a large price, we'll retain territory, we'll prevent the refugees from coming back, because we paid in blood for all of this. And Latrun, in some sense, was part of that, part of the payment in blood, one of the large payments. So there was a sort of an interest even in exaggerating the numbers in Latrun.
I think the Latrun myth served several functions. One function was that it was a proof for the myth of the few against many. The general balance of power was not reflected in the Latrun battle, but it was very important for the Jewish state and for those who constructed the collective memory to turn Latrun into the war itself, to claim that the balance of power there was the balance of power elsewhere, because that created another myth, the myth of the moral superiority. How can a smaller David defeat a huge Goliath if he is weak in every military aspect? The answer is very clear, because it has a moral superiority, because it is a just party in the conflict, because it has history on its side, or if you want, God on its side, and so on.
More than 50 years after the 1948 war, long after the guns at Latrun fell silent, the early myths that defined the birth of Israel still refuse to relinquish their hold on the collective memory of the country, and continue to shape the nation's policy in the unresolved conflict with the Palestinians. As the ongoing violence takes an ever greater toll, the search for a solution becomes increasingly urgent. For Israel, that search must include an honest reckoning with its own history, coming face to face with all the myths that stand as obstacles to a just and lasting peace.